13 women strangled, one confession, zero physical evidence at the scenes. For 60 years, Boston believed it had its monster, but the DNA, the contradictions, and a prison stabbing tell a darker story, and what we found at minute 14 changes everything. Between June 1962 and January 1964, the city of Boston lived under a shadow it could not name. 13 women, ranging in age from 19 to 85, were found strangled inside their own apartments. The doors were locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. The killer had been invited in or had talked his way past the chain. And when he left behind a ritual so specific, so taunting, that it would brand itself into American criminal history. The victims were posed. Their stockings, or sometimes the cords from their own bathrobes, were tied around their necks in an elaborate bow, like a grotesque gift. The press gave the killer a single name, the Boston Strangler. But 6 decades later, the most disturbing question about this case is not who he was. It is whether the man who confessed, the man who went to prison for it, the man whose name became synonymous with the crimes, ever killed any of them at all. The first victim was Anna Slesser. She was 55 years old, divorced, living alone in an apartment on Gainsborough Street in Boston's Back Bay. On the afternoon of June 14, 1962, her son Juris arrived to take her to dinner. He found her on the bathroom floor. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with the cord of her own housecoat, tied in that strange decorative bow under her chin. The apartment had been ransacked, but nothing of value was missing. Detectives at the time assumed it was a burglary gone wrong. 2 weeks later, on June 30th, the body of Nina Nichols, 68, was discovered in her Brighton apartment. She had been strangled with 2 of her own nylon stockings, knotted in the same theatrical bow. That same day, in Lynn, just north of Boston, Helen Blake, 65, was found in identical condition. 2 victims, 2 cities, 1 signature. By the end of that summer, the body count had risen to 6, all women, all living alone, all elderly, all strangled with articles of their own clothing posed in sexually degrading positions, their killer leaving the scene as quietly as he had arrived. Attorney General Edward Brooke established a special task force, the so-called Strangler Bureau, in early 1963. They consulted psychiatrists, mediums, even a Dutch clairvoyant named Peter Herkos, who was flown in at considerable expense and produced nothing useful. The profile the experts assembled described a man with a deep hatred of his mother, sexually inadequate, probably homosexual, almost certainly working alone, almost certainly choosing victims who reminded him of a maternal figure he despised. And then, in December 1962, the pattern broke. Sophie Clark was 20 years old, black, a student, strangled in her Huntington Avenue apartment, posed in the same way with stockings tied around her neck. A month later, Patricia Bissett, 23, then Beverly Sammons, 26, who had been stabbed as well as strangled. Then Evelyn Corbin, 58. Then Joanne Graff, 23, a Sunday school teacher. And finally, on January 4, 1964, Mary Sullivan, 19, found seated on her bed in Charles Street, a broom handle protruding from her body, a card reading Happy New Year placed at her feet. The shift in victimology baffled investigators. The first 6 victims were elderly women. The later 7 were predominantly young. Some criminologists at the time argued that this was not the work of one man, but of 2 or even more killers, with later murderers imitating the original signature. The 13 cases were never officially linked by forensic evidence. They were linked by pattern, by atmosphere, by the city's fear. And then, almost as suddenly as they had begun, the killings stopped. Enter Albert DeSalvo. He was 33 years old, a married father of 2, a former Army sergeant with a thick Boston accent, working as a maintenance man. He had a long arrest record, but not for murder. He was known to police as the measuring man. He had a peculiar scam. He would knock on apartment doors, claim to represent a modeling agency, and convince young women to let him take their measurements with a tape measure for a supposed casting call. He never went further than that. Later, he escalated into a string of sexual assaults across 4 states under the alias the Green Man, named for the green work pants he wore. He was arrested for those assaults in late 1964 and committed to Bridgewater State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. It was there, inside Bridgewater, that DeSalvo first told another inmate something extraordinary. The other inmate was George Nassar, an extremely intelligent man with an IQ reported to be in the genius range, awaiting trial for an unrelated execution-style murder. According to Nassar, DeSalvo confessed to him that he was the Boston Strangler. Nassar contacted his lawyer, a young, ambitious attorney named F. Lee Bailey, who would later become one of the most famous defense lawyers in America. Bailey took on DeSalvo as a client, and over the course of weeks in 1965, in a series of taped interrogations, Albert DeSalvo confessed in extraordinary detail to all 13 Strangler murders, plus 2 additional killings the police had never connected to the case. The confessions were astonishing. DeSalvo described apartments he had never been seen entering. He described furniture arrangements, the position of bodies, items left at scenes, in detail that seemed impossible to fabricate. He told investigators things that, in the words of one detective, only the killer could know. And yet, from the very beginning, something was wrong. DeSalvo also got things wrong. Significant things. He misremembered the color of carpets. He described wounds that did not exist. He claimed to have killed one victim by stabbing when she had in fact been strangled. He described entering one apartment through a door that had been bolted from the inside in a way he could not have managed. Investigators noticed something else. DeSalvo had a near photographic memory. He was known among inmates and guards at Bridgewater for being able to recall newspaper articles he had read weeks earlier. And by 1965, every detail of every Strangler murder had been printed, dissected, photographed, and rephotographed across Boston's newspapers. The crime scene photographs had circulated, in some cases even within the prison itself. Here is the most damning fact, and it is the fact most people who know this case only superficially have never been told. Albert DeSalvo was never tried for any of the Strangler murders, not one. Not a single charge was ever filed against him for the killings he confessed to. His confessions were given under a confidential arrangement brokered by F. Lee Bailey, and they were never used in court. DeSalvo was instead tried in 1967 for the Green Man assaults, the earlier sexual attacks. He was convicted, sentenced to life, and sent to Walpole State Prison. The public assumed he was the Strangler. The newspapers said he was the Strangler. The case in the eyes of the city was closed. But legally, the Boston Strangler murders remained unsolved. Why did DeSalvo confess? There are several theories, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is money. DeSalvo's wife and children were destitute. He believed, based partly on conversations with Nassar, that if he confessed to the most infamous crimes in the country, he could sell the rights to his story. Movie deals, book deals. He spoke openly to other inmates about how much his confession would be worth. The second theory is that George Nassar was the actual killer, or at least one of the killers, and that he coached DeSalvo through the confessions to deflect suspicion from himself. Nassar had been free during the period of the murders. He fit several elements of the original psychological profile better than DeSalvo did. He was extraordinarily intelligent, he was violent, and he had access to DeSalvo for hours every day inside Bridgewater. Some of the original investigators, including Detective Lieutenant Edward Sherry, came to believe in later years that Nassar was a far more plausible suspect than the man who confessed. The third theory is the simplest and the most uncomfortable. The murders were committed by several different men, and DeSalvo was responsible for some, perhaps a handful, perhaps none. The earliest victims, the elderly women, fit one psychological profile. The later victims, the young women, several of whom were also stabbed or mutilated, fit another entirely. The notion that one offender escalated, de-escalated, changed victim type radically, and then stopped is statistically almost unheard of in the history of serial murder. Most serial killers refine their victim type over time. They do not abandon it. The Boston pattern, when laid out on paper, looks less like one killer and more like a city in the grip of a contagion. For decades, the families of the victims lived with this ambiguity, none more so than the family of Mary Sullivan, the last and youngest victim. Her nephew, Casey Sherman, grew up with whispered doubts in his family. His mother, Mary's sister, had never believed DeSalvo killed her. In the late 1990s, Casey Sherman began his own investigation. He worked with Elaine Whitfield Sharp, a defense attorney, and with the family of Albert DeSalvo, who also wanted the truth. In 2000, the bodies of Mary Sullivan and Albert DeSalvo were exhumed. Forensic experts, including Dr. James Starrs of George Washington University, examined the remains. They concluded that biological material recovered from Mary Sullivan's body did not match Albert DeSalvo. In a press conference in December 2001, Starrs stated bluntly, "It is indicative, strongly indicative, of the fact that Albert DeSalvo was not the rape murderer of Mary Sullivan." For the families, this seemed like vindication of a doubt they had carried for nearly 40 years. And then, in July 2013, the story turned again. Boston police, using modern DNA technology and material discreetly collected from a water bottle discarded by one of DeSalvo's nephews, announced a familial DNA match. Seminal fluid recovered from the scene of Mary Sullivan's murder, preserved on a blanket for nearly half a century, matched the DeSalvo family line. After his body was exhumed a second time, direct comparison confirmed it. The DNA on the blanket was Albert DeSalvo's, to a probability of 1 in 220 billion. The headlines declared the case finally solved. Albert DeSalvo, after all, had been the Boston Strangler. But read those headlines carefully, and you will see what they do not say. The DNA proved that DeSalvo had sexual contact with Mary Sullivan at or near the time of her death. It proved he was in her apartment. It proved beyond reasonable doubt that he killed her. It did not prove he killed any of the other 12 women. And in the years since 2013, no DNA evidence has ever publicly tied DeSalvo to any of the other Strangler victims. This matters, because if Albert DeSalvo killed Mary Sullivan but not the others, then the Boston Strangler as a single figure never existed. The murders were the work of multiple men, some perhaps copycats, some perhaps opportunists working within a city that had grown accustomed to the headlines, and one of them at least has never been caught. The 2013 DNA results solved one murder. It deepened the mystery of the other 12. There is one more piece to this puzzle, and it is the piece that haunts investigators to this day. On November 25, 1973, Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in the infirmary of Walpole State Prison. He had been killed by another inmate or by several, and the murder was never solved. The day before he died, DeSalvo had called a journalist named Robert McLaughlin. He told him he wanted to give a complete interview. He said he had something new to reveal about the Strangler murders, something he had never told anyone, something that would change the public understanding of the case. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning. DeSalvo did not live to keep it. Whatever he intended to say died with him in that infirmary. And the men who killed him, whether they were settling a prison grudge or silencing him on someone else's orders, never explained themselves. So where does that leave us? 6 decades later, 13 women dead, one man who confessed to all of them, DNA evidence tying that man to only one murder, a psychological profile that fits another suspect better, a confession riddled with errors but rich in detail freely available in newspapers, an attorney with a vested interest in his client becoming the most famous criminal in America, a jailhouse informant who may have coached the confession, and a prison murder on the eve of a promised revelation that no one was ever held accountable for. The Boston Strangler is not a man. The Boston Strangler is a name we gave to a wound in a city that needed someone to blame. Albert DeSalvo is part of that story. He killed Mary Sullivan. He may have killed others. But there is at least one strangler, possibly more, who walked the streets of Boston in the 1960s and was never named, never charged, never punished. They lived out their lives in anonymity. They died of natural causes, in their own beds, perhaps in apartments not unlike the ones they entered uninvited so many years ago. And the question that should keep us awake, the question Boston has never fully answered, is not whether Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. The question is who else was. And whether, in the silence after the last murder in January 1964, the real killer simply stopped, satisfied, and watched another man take the blame for everything he had done. If this case left you with more questions than answers, you are exactly the kind of viewer Dark Cases was built for. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us next week as we open another file the world prefers to forget. Like, comment, and tell us who you think the real Boston Strangler was.